Welcome back. Thanks for joining us. We should be able to wrap up our conclusion of the Song of Songs today. We are going to dive in with chapter 6. And before we do, I want to read a portion from chapter 5 from a different translation to sort of kind of remind us of the mindset of the language that we've been listening to in this text. The translation I'm using here is the Song of Songs by Michael V. Fox. Can't get it even on the camera. The Song of Songs and the Ancient Egyptian Love Songs. Michael V. Fox is an expert in ancient Middle Eastern languages, including Hebrew. He's the former dean of the Hebrew and Semitic Studies Department at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So when he does a translation of a Hebrew text, most people sit up and listen. So one of the reasons why I read this is because we're diving into 6, and Fox suggests that the first 3 verses of 6 actually belong to the narrative that starts with 5:2. And if you'll recall, I said that the end of 5:1 marked the exact middle of the Song of Songs, so that too is a good reason why Fox may be right in his take on this. So, Fox translates the beginning of chapter 5. I slumbered, but my heart was alert. Listen, my beloved is entreating. Open to me, my sister, my darling, my dove, my perfect one. For my head is drenched with dew, my locks with the mist of the night. I have slipped off my robe. How can I put it on? I have bathed my feet. How can I get them soiled? My beloved stretched his hand in through the hole, and my insides moaned for him. I arose to open to my beloved, and my hands dripped myrrh, my fingers liquid myrrh, on the handles of the lock. I opened to my beloved, but my beloved had turned away and gone. And then the rest of chapter 5 is the story of her seeking her beloved. And then chapter 6 opens with the conclusion of this narrative, according to Fox. Which way did your beloved go? These are the girls of Jerusalem speaking. Which way did your beloved go, O most beautiful of women? Which way did your beloved turn, that we may seek him with you? My beloved has gone down to his garden, to the beds of spices, to graze in the gardens, and to gather the lilies. I am my beloved's, and my beloved is mine. He grazes among the lilies. And Fox suggests that final line, he grazes among the lilies, it suggests a very physical, intimate, and erotic encounter. So that's the context into which we enter what we...
So that translation, that's his interpretation of what it says in Hebrew?
So, well, it's his translation of the text, and if you actually want to get into the nuance of it, looking at how he does this, he actually walks through the process in at least with some of the text of how he comes to his translations, and he'll go through it. He will look at, here's what this scholar says, here's how it's been interpreted by this person, here's how it's been translated, there's an argument that says that it should be emendated this way. I mean, he goes on, some of these passages, he'll go on for like 2 pages talking about the translation.
It's a summary of what other scholars are saying? Or is it that plus the fact, is he a Hebrew scholar?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So, and he's a Hebrew linguist or language expert.
Yeah, I would have to go check his VC, but as the chair of the Hebrew and Semitic Studies Department at the UW of Madison, he would have been required to have a mastery of at least biblical Hebrew, if not biblical and modern Hebrew. He would have had to be proficient in, I think, at least 5 other Semitic languages, like Canaanite, Ugaritic, that sort of thing. I get the impression, I haven't, like I said, I haven't checked his VC, but I get the impression that he had some knowledge of Egyptian, whether it was Coptic or hieroglyphic or both. And then he would have also had to have significant working knowledge of French and German as a minimum.
So what you just read is his translation of the text with input from other scholars that he's
read,
taking of, made aware of, or he's...
Right. He's not just sitting down with the text and translating. He's looking at the collection of all the scholarly work that's been done on translating the text up to the present, and then translating it. And at times, especially where it's confusing or uncertain, he'll look to the Septuagint, which is the Greek, and he'll talk about whether or not that plays an influence in how we might interpret or translate the text. So,
what's the dominant language in Israel today?
Today? Oh, that's a good question.
Is it English?
If I were going to guess, I would guess it's English, but I'm really not sure, because it could be Aramaic, it could be modern Aramaic.
You've been there, haven't you?
Yeah. Well, so like any American traveler, most of the time that I spent in Israel was in more heavily populated areas where people are likely to speak English.
And you're going to have a guide who speaks English.
So Israel's also weird in that Hebrew has been lost, has been a lost language at least twice in human history, and it has had to be recovered.
Well, I guess that's my real question. Do the people of Israel speak Hebrew at all, except within the synagogue?
Yes, because some of their signs, and especially if you get into some of the more obscure areas, they're only in Hebrew. Like, for example, when I was there, I went looking for the tomb of Rabbi Akiva, and it was just me and one other college kid who were going, and I had to figure out how to get there by translating modern Hebrew signs into biblical Hebrew and then into English, so I could figure out where we were going.
How many times did you get lost?
None. Well, none. Ironically, none getting there. Like 3 times on the way going back to the hotel. But the part of the problem was, by the time it was such a long walk and it was mostly uphill, by the time we got there and got a good look around and did everything, and we're on our way back to the hotel, it was getting late, we were getting tired, and we kept taking shortcuts. And yeah, so there were a lot of the way home we didn't know where we were. But we made it fine, obviously. So anyways, so of course Fox's big argument here is that Song of Songs is so heavily parallels Egyptian love songs, ancient Egyptian love songs, that of course his translation is going to push more in the direction of romantic poetry rather than any theological position. Although he's also, I mean, if you're a biblical Hebrew scholar, you're going to have some element of theological interpretation along with it, regardless of your beliefs. And I don't know what his beliefs were, whether he was a believer or not, Jewish or Christian or what. So, anyways. So yeah, I just wanted to put us back into the mindset of we're dealing with a text that's in our Bibles, and yet it has some pretty distinct language compared to other texts in the Bible. And with that, if someone would be willing to read chapter 6.
I'll do chapter 6.
Go for it.
Where has your beloved gone, most beautiful of women? Which way did your beloved turn, that we may look for him with you? My beloved has gone down to his garden, to the beds of spices, to browse in the gardens and to gather lilies. I am my beloved's, and my beloved is mine. He browses among the lilies, praising the bride's beauty. You are as beautiful as Tirzah, my darling, as lovely as Jerusalem, as majestic as troops with banners. Turn your eyes from me, they overwhelm me. Your hair is like a flock of goats descending from Gilead. Your teeth are like a flock of sheep coming up from the washing. Each has its twin, not one of them is missing. Your temples behind your veil are like the halves of a pomegranate. 60 queens there may be, and 80 concubines, and virgins beyond numbers. But my dove, my perfect one, is unique, the only daughter of her mother, the favorite of the one who bore her. The young woman saw her and called her blessed. The queens and concubines praised her. Who is this that appears like the dawn, fair as the moon, bright as the sun, majestic as the stars in procession? I went down to the groves of nut trees to look at the new growth in the valley, to see if the vines had budded or the pomegranate were in bloom. Before I realized it, my desire set me among the royal chariots of my people. Come back, O Shalyamite. Come back, that we may graze on you. Why would you graze on the Shalyamite, as on the dances of the whatever?
As upon a dance before two armies.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so as we come towards the end of the Song of Songs, we do get a few additional voices added in here, and so there's some occasions where we're not sure who the speaker is. So this final verse of this chapter, why should you look upon the Shulamite as upon a dance before two armies? We don't really know who the speaker is there, whether it's the guy or whether it's third person narrative speaker. Likely because of the patterns in the language, the verse before that is the daughters of Jerusalem again. But things start to get kind of messy and ambiguous as we get towards the end for some reason. And Fox even acknowledges it's hard to draw lines between different narratives and separate these out and break them down compared to the earlier parts of the book. Once again, we have the guide describing the woman in such wonderful ways as her teeth being like flocks of ewes with none of them missing, each having their own twin, right? Or hair like a flock of goats. Did her hair not smell good? But no, yeah. If you've ever seen goats running as a flock,
It's beautiful.
It's
On the
gorgeous.
hillside.
Yeah.
When I was in Oxford, Barb and I took a week and we went up to Scotland. And I'll never forget we were on a road and there was just a beautiful mountainside and there was a huge flock of, I think it was sheep, not goats, but anyway up there, and they were moving. It was just like flowing water. It was so cool.
And that's an imagery that's going to keep coming up in regards to her hair, is this idea of something that flows, like a stream or a river or waters. So there is that imagery, but it's intriguing because we get some cultural clashes. It's one of the fascinating thing about Song of Songs is we repeatedly have these descriptions where this man is describing a woman. And the two most dominant metaphors in here for her are animals and structures, walls, shields, towers, those two sets of metaphors keep coming up.
Fruit.
There's fruit, but the fruit is likely a metaphor for passion or indulgence. There are a few occasions where she is described with fruit, like the two halves of pomegranate here. But the intriguing thing is that as a culture, I mean, look at cultural shift. How many women would like to have their beauty described like an animal, or like a wall, or a tower, or a shield? Like those metaphors don't play out anymore, or even fruit. I mean, that's pretty much considered insulting today if you start talking about a person's pomegranates. So there's a significant cultural shift, but it is intriguing what imageries are used at different times for beauty. Anything else jump out or interesting in this chapter to anyone?
Mine, where you said he pastures among the lilies, mine says he pastures his flock among the lilies, so they must have tried to soften that up.
Yeah, so that is one. The word flock gets added a few times in translations to this text. We've seen it before. I forget what chapter it was in, but there was another occasion where I think it was in chapter 2 where he talks about pasturing in the fields, and many of the translations add in the word flock in order to de-emphasize any kind of passionate interpretation. Would anyone care to take on chapter 7 then?
Okay.
Okay.
How graceful are your feet in sandals, O queenly maiden. Your rounded thighs are like jewels, the work of a master hand. Your navel is a rounded bowl that never lacks mixed wine. Your belly is a heap of wheat encircled with lilies. Your two breasts are like two fawns, twins of a gazelle. Your neck is like an ivory tower. Your eyes are pools in Heshbon, by the gate of Bath-rabbim. Your nose is like a tower of Lebanon, overlooking Damascus. Your head crowns you like Carmel, and your flowing locks are like purple. The king is held captive in the tresses. How fair and pleasant you are, O loved one, delectable maiden. You are stately as a palm tree, and your breasts are like its clusters. I say, I will climb the palm tree and lay hold of its branches. O may your breasts be like clusters of the vine, and the scent of your breath like apples, and your kisses like the best wine that goes down smoothly, gliding over lips and teeth. I am my beloved's, and his desire is for me. Come, my beloved, let us go forth into the fields and lodge in the villages. Let us go out early in the vineyards and see whether the vines have budded, whether the grape blossoms have opened, and the pomegranates are in bloom. There I will give you my love. The mandrakes give forth fragrance, and over our doors are all choice fruits, new as well as old, which I have laid up for you, O my beloved.
Okay, thank you. So yet another description, and I caught your laugh there. It's a good one.
Towers and
Yeah, your nose is like a tower of Lebanon, right?
Yeah.
Like, gee.
You're big.
Probably not. Walls and structures might not always be straight in the ancient world, but towers, because of their height, had to be built very carefully so that they were very, very straight. I mean, they might have leaned, but the line of the building was very straight, no matter whether it was straight vertical or straight angling upward. And so he's probably suggesting her nose is very straight. She doesn't have a crooked nose,
Okay.
right? Yeah, it is kind of interesting how some of the descriptions of beauty are, if you read into it a little too carefully, it's so that part of you isn't screwed up, right? But there's something to be said about that. Our modern day medicine has provided us with the ability to fix all kinds of things. We can set bones well. We have dentists who take care of teeth. So he marvels repeatedly at how she has all her teeth and how beautiful that is and amazing that is. I mean, modern dentistry, most of us have all our teeth. So, but for him, in this context, that's exceptional.
Yeah.
The belly is a heap of wheat. We're not really sure the context because
Is it good to be fat?
well, you might think so. If we actually look at cultural artwork from the time period, or around the time period where this is likely written, the art suggests that the imagery of beauty is slender but healthy to a slight belly on a woman, not fat, not really heavy, but and so the heap of wheat. I mean, if you look at wheat farms, how wheat gets heaped up, those usually aren't small piles. So one of the arguments is that so she is healthy. She eats well enough to be healthy, a healthy weight. But maybe the imagery is more about sort of the golden tone of the wheat, that her skin has a golden hue to it. Which, if that's what's intended here, that fits in well to our discussion back where she says, I am black but beautiful, and like the tents of, where was it, Tiber?
Yeah, because she works outside the beauty.
Right. So she's, in that passage, she's probably overemphasizing the amount of tan, the darkness of her skin. But here he's interpreting her skin as being golden, right? Wheat colored. Let's see. There's a pun in the Hebrew in verse 4. Your eyes are like pools of Heshbon. The Hebrew word for eyes and the Hebrew word for it actually says springs. The Hebrew word for springs sound almost identical, so he's got a little pun going on in there. Not that that matters for a whole lot of anything. Again, he's really fascinated by her hair. We saw that in the previous one. This time its flowing locks are like purple, and the king, remember she calls him a king early on, is held captive in the tresses. He's hung up on her hair. He's held captive by it, captivated. Yeah. Anything else interesting, odd, or jump out? Okay. And the final chapter.
Oh, that you were like a brother to me, that nursed at my mother's breast. If I met you outside, I would kiss you, and none would despise me. I would lead you and bring you into the house of my mother, and into the chamber of her that conceived me. I would give you spiced wine to drink, the juice of my pomegranates. Oh, that his left hand were under my head, and that his right hand embraced me. I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, that you stir not up, nor awaken love, until it please. Who is that coming up from the wilderness, leaning upon her beloved? Under the apple tree I awakened you. There your mother was in travail with you. There she who bore you was in travail. Set me as a seal upon your heart, as a seal upon your arm. For love is strong as death, Jealousy is cruel as the grave. Its flashes are flashes of fire, a most vehement flame. Many waters cannot quench love, neither can floods drown it. If a man offered for love all the wealth of his house, it would be utterly scorned. We have a little sister, and she has no breast. What shall we do for our sister on the day when she is spoken for? If she is a wall, we will build upon her a battlement of silver. But if she is a door, we will enclose her with boards of cedar. I was a wall, and my breasts were like towers. Then I was in his eyes as one who brings peace. Solomon had a vineyard of Balhaman. He let out the vineyard to keepers. Each one was to bring for its fruit 1,000 pieces of silver. My vineyard, my very own, is for myself. You, O Solomon, may have 1,000, and the keepers of the fruit 200. O you who dwell in the gardens, my companions are listening for your voice. Let me hear it. Make haste, my beloved, and be like a gazelle or a young stag upon the mountains of spices.
Okay. And then
I have no idea why this book belongs in the Bible.
okay, we'll talk about that. I want to look at we got some time yet. I want to look at this chapter first. It ends with the female voice saying, "Hurry up." So it's an interesting piece if taken as one piece of poetry altogether, like as that you might recite to a person or send to a person. There are frequent occasions, descriptions throughout this that suggest this is a story of something that happened, right? These are, whether we interpret them as allegories, which we'll talk about how both Judaism and Christianity has interpreted them as allegories, or you take it more literally. These are descriptions of intimate and in some places even erotic encounters. The intriguing thing is it then ends with a call to hurry up, right? Which, if you are writing love poetry, erotic or otherwise, to someone else, you might end with, "and hurry up," because you're sending it to someone. Which suggests we don't actually know who the author of this text is, but it very well might have been the female voice in here, that she has taken on writing for the man, writing the man's parts and the other voices that are in the poetry, and she is describing this experience, and then she is sending it off to someone, and of course at the end she ends with this. Verse 14. By the way, hurry up. She's calling him to her. Now, that's significant if that's what this is, because one, you don't get a whole lot of female authors in the ancient world. You don't even get them in the pre-modern world. They're pretty rare. And for a woman to take control of her own sexuality to this degree would be pretty extreme. So this, in a lot of ways, this flies in the face of many patriarchal societies throughout history that have generally sought to limit and control sexuality, especially the sexuality of women. And for that reason, Song of Songs has actually been a very popular text within feminist and womanist studies of Scripture. Because there's some implications that this is about a woman claiming her own sexuality, which is in this chapter. I want to go back to starting at verse 8. We have this line, "We have a little sister." Now, that jumps out of us out of the blue. It kind of makes it just kind of hits you in the face. We have a little sister and she has no breasts, right? That is just weird unless you go back to chapter 1, verse 6. "Do not gaze at me because I am dark, because the sun has gazed on me. My mother's sons," her brothers, were angry with me, and they made me the keeper of the vineyards, but my own vineyard I have not kept. We talked about that on the first day. So she's acknowledged that she has brothers, right? And her brothers, in chapter 1, essentially kept her from growing up to be a woman by making her a laborer in the vineyards. That's why her skin has been tanned so much by the sun, because she's been laboring outdoors. She's been kept away from that social life that that women would often develop if they wanted to pursue marriage or something of that nature. And she's acknowledged that very early on in this. It's almost a bookend for the book, for this book, for her to start by saying, this is the life that I used to live. I used to be controlled by my brothers who kept me in the vineyard to make sure that I wouldn't have a social life and meet a man, right? Or meet a romantic interest, or whatever. And it ends with, the brothers get to have a voice here in 8:8. We have a little sister and she has no breasts. That's their description of her. What we shall do for our sister on the day when she is spoken for. They're questioning. What are we going to do when a suitor comes along? What happens when a man comes for our sister? Here's what we'll do. There's two options. If she's a wall or if she's a door. Okay? This is talking about, they're addressing her position in her openness to an encounter with this man, with the suitor, right? This is about her chastity, or her availability for marriage, if you want to put it in a less physical situation. If she's a wall, then she is already chaste, right? She's built a wall. She's not going to respond to the suitor. She's already acting chaste. If that's the case, then we will build her a battlement and adorn it with silver. So we're gonna help her defend that wall if she's a wall. But if she's a door, we're gonna board her up, right? I mean, that's what they say. We will enclose her with boards of cedar, and cedar is very strong wood. So if she's a door, if she's open to the possibility of an encounter with this man, the brothers are going to put boards over her. They're going to control her. And her response is, I was a wall. In other words, she did keep chaste, or at least led a life that didn't allow her to encounter men. Then comes this kind of strange words, especially since the brothers describe her as she has no breasts, right? And she says, and my breasts were like towers, right? Which is like, is she bragging? No. Here's the distinction. If a wall is chastity, if the wall is the obscurement to her life, then having breasts like towers means that she is taking control of her own sexuality, right? She's making a very powerful claim here in contrast to the way her brothers are perceiving her. And then she goes on to say, and then I was in his eyes as one who brings peace. Like, there was something about how she was living, how she was able to take control of her own sexuality that allowed this man, this suitor that she is now writing to see her, despite the wall built up around her. So it's a metaphor that kind of gets lost in a lot of the imagery. There is also, worth noting here, at the end of verse 6, where she talks about, well, I'll read all of 6. Set me as a seal upon your heart, as a seal upon your arm. So first off, upon your heart and upon your arm are the descriptions we get from Deuteronomy about where you put the Word of God, the Torah, the pledge, the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is one. I'm blanking on what the words are, but the Shema in Deuteronomy 6, 4, 6, I always mix those up. In Judaism and in earlier Israelite religion, the Shema, this passage from Deuteronomy, would be written down on a scrap of paper or on a shard of pottery or whatever, and it would be put on doorposts. In fact, if you're out and about and you look at houses, and sometimes even apartment doors, sometimes you'll see a little metal strip that's about 2.5 inches long, and it'll be at an angle, and it'll be screwed or nailed onto the side of the doorpost. And if you were to take that down and open it up, inside there'll be a little scroll piece that'll have this passage from Deuteronomy in it. And it all comes from this piece in Deuteronomy where God tells the people to have the Torah, to have this prayer, this word, on their doorposts, on their foreheads, and on their arms. And if you ever meet very Orthodox Jews today, and you get a chance to see them while they're in study or prayer, a lot of them will, before they sit down to read the Torah, they'll have this thing that they wrap around their forehead that has a square box on top of it, and that they wrap around their arm. And they do that before they pray or before they study because of that passage in Deuteronomy. And so here, now there's no mention of doorposts, but set me as a seal upon your heart, as a seal upon your arm. This is one of the strongest biblical, theological things in this whole book right here, that for most of us, especially in Christianity, we would just breeze right past. So she, at this point, if this is a romantic letter, she's comparing this relationship with the man to a divine calling, right? Or if it's allegory, then this is the proof of the allegory, because here's one of those few parts that really hits home. But she's not done there. She goes on. For love is strong as death, passion fierce as the grave. Its flashes are flashes of fire, a raging flame. And in the Hebrew here, it implies a flame of Yah, which is one of the names for God. So she's invoking the flame of God in her description of her passion. So right there, verse 6 is probably the most theological, religious verse in this whole story, and it's packed with reference and metaphor for that aspect. All right. One other bit of chapter 8 that deserves commentary because it's pretty strange, which is the opening of it. Because she's saying to the man, "Oh, that you were my brother," or like a brother to me, which sounds kind of creepy. Of course, we live in a culture where it's often illegal to marry your first cousin, let alone a sibling. This is not such a culture, right? The issues with intermarriage are not strongly expressed in this culture. So the idea of her being in love with somebody who is also like a brother or an actual brother doesn't give them the heebie-jeebies like it might many of us today. Her point here is, if you were like a brother to me, we could just go right into the family house and nobody would care, right? And then we could go right to my mother's bedchamber, to the place where I was conceived. Oh, which reminds me, I missed this. Verse 13 of the previous chapter mentions the mandrakes that give forth fragrance. Mandrakes draws back to the Genesis story of Jacob. Jacob has 2 wives and 2 handmaidens who bear him the 12 children, 13, 12 of whom are male and make up the tribes of Israel. But the 2 wives, Leah and Rachel, kind of fight over him. And one of the things that they do is one of them will essentially trade his bed one night with the other one in exchange for mandrakes, which to us is weird, but mandrakes have historically been a symbol of fertility and virility in
What's a mandrake?
it's a plant. It's a root plant, like a tuber.
Oh, okay.
It's funny. It's one of those things that when I was Harry Potter. This is kind of off the subject, but there's a scene in the Harry Potter movies and the Harry Potter books where the kids have to go and they learn to replant mandrakes. Only in the Harry Potter universe, the mandrakes are magical and they scream ear-shattering pitches and stuff like that. But it's strange because there's a lot of subtle teenage-type relationships between boys and girls in the story that kind of keep pushing out. And it's a weird thing if you know what mandrakes are a reference for, that they have these kids in a world that has magic and alchemical properties and things like that. That all of a sudden you have boys and girls replanting mandrakes together. It's like, whoa, wait, what? And I wondered the first time I read that scene, I was like, wait, does she know what she's writing? I think she did. But anyway. But so, yeah, there's this description here of, I wish I could just take you into the family house and no one would bat an eye. And clearly she has purposes because she just got done talking about mandrakes. Okay. Any thoughts or questions on 8 before we talk about the canonization of Song of Songs? Okay, so we got 2 different religions that are canonizing our Bibles over the course of right around or just after the time of Jesus. In Judaism fights about this for almost 100 years, about whether or not this should be one of the scrolls, one of the things that is part of
Song of
Songs, yeah, Song of Solomon. Essentially, the reason it gets canonized, there's a twofold reason. One, everybody believes it's written by Solomon at this point. So that alone is enough to go, we need to find a way to include it. Of course, it's problematic because it's still pretty difficult and kind of racy. And so the second argument to include it is, well, wait a second, this isn't about erotic love. It's a metaphor it's an allegory of God's love for Israel. And so this idea that this is an allegory for God's love for Israel, which, yeah, it's a little bit problematic. It's a little bit hard to read that way. But that's what develops, and that's how it gets included in the Jewish canon. Before we have well before modern day Judaism, but that's how it makes it in. It's worth noting, Rabbi Akiva had words to say about this. That was the guy whose tomb I went to when I was in Israel. So, anyways, Rabbi Akiva is one of the big. There's a handful of like big rabbis in Judaism who are just like, that's the guy, right? And so Rabbi Akiva is one of them. And Rabbi Akiva writes that Song of Songs here, if we're including this in our canon, then okay, but nobody can read this at a celebration or popular event because it's just too racy, right? Only under religious, reserved, careful circumstances where we're controlling the discussion of it. Otherwise, don't read it outside of that, right? Okay, so that's Judaism. Christianity comes along and runs into the same problem. What do we do with this? And interestingly enough, it's Origen, who is one of the church fathers, who is the first to really push the idea of including it in the canon. And Origen is living right around the same time that that Judaism is making this canon, maybe about 100 years later at most. And Origen pushes to include the Song of Songs as evidence of God's love for God's people, both individually and collectively. So again, we get the idea that this is an allegory, and it's about God's love for God's people, which parallels with sort of the Jewish allegory interpretation. The interesting thing is, Origen's kind of a questionable figure in church history. Origen has a tendency to kind of push at the boundaries of what the church considers acceptable. And at one point, I believe he even gets excommunicated. Although what he gets excommunicated for is trying to argue that the salvific effect, the saving power of the act of Jesus dying on the cross, is so great that someday even the devil himself will be saved. Right? This is one of the more radical claims that Origen makes. And actually, so Origen is one of the first people to push the idea of universal salvation, which is something we still argue about today.
And when did he live?
The early 3rd century, maybe late 2nd century.
And
I think he died like 234 or
his name?
something. Just like the word origin, except with an E instead of an I.
Okay.
Origen, if I remember correctly. Of course, I mean, he wasn't writing in English, so best guess on translation. But yeah, so Origen writes a lot of radical things, so it's not that surprising that he's willing to push to include this. The interesting thing is that over time then, within Christianity, the use of this as allegory for God's love kind of keeps ramping up with every generation. And it keeps building more and more. And so by not long after it gets accepted as canon, the allegory shifts from God's love for God's people to God's love for God's church. And then the interpretation shifts, and around the 11th century, where we're dealing with the church splitting between East and West, and the Renaissance, there's crusades happening, there's I think we're coming out of, or going into the Dark Ages, I forget. The 11th century is very chaotic for the church world, and one of the things that the church does during this time period, right around the 11th century, is it really starts to clamp down with lots of rules. So, you know how Catholic priests aren't allowed to marry? This comes about right around the 11th century. The moralistic interpretation, which starts pushing the idea that this is described as a wedding, a marriage. There's a lot of marriage and wedding language added to the interpretation of this. That happens around the 11th century. A lot of the social morality that the church advocates starts to develop in the 11th century. So we have a broad cultural shift within the church at that time. And then in the following century, the Holy Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Church, which is modern-day Catholic Church, takes this one step further and makes this Song of Songs into an allegory for God's love for Mary. Which is interesting because the female voice both starts and ends this book, which would suggest that it's the female voice that's dominant here. So if anything, it would be Mary's love for God, but that becomes the interpretation. And of course, the hard part is, once something is canon, which we get in the 4th and 5th centuries is when the Christian canon gets established. Once it's there, once it's been determined to be canon, the church doesn't go back and start throwing things out. It sort of wrestles with reinterpreting it, right? Like, how do we understand this better, or how does it fit better with what we're teaching and preaching? Which is, in the case of Song of Songs, that's what we see. So, a scholar of history might look at, and some have, this development over time and suggest that maybe the real issue is that this didn't belong in the Bible in the first place, right? That might be an interpretation. That's one way to look at it. I like to believe, in part because I think it's a little bit necessary for faith, or for having any kind of structure to our religion or belief, that for whatever reason, whatever is in our Bibles is there with an intent, a divine intent, right? And so while this doesn't seem to fit unless you start applying a lot of allegory to it, to our scripture, maybe God would be happy to have this in the Bible. And if so, why would that be? Well, maybe our issues in human history, but especially in the relatively modern era of the last few centuries, where we're hung up on sex and sexuality, promiscuity versus chastity or purity, is not God's intent. Or maybe we're supposed to push at those boundaries. Maybe love, joy, delight, those experiences of life, even sex, are part of God's intention. And even joy in sex may be part of God's intention. And what I would look to support that is in the rest of Scripture, especially in the Hebrew Bible, God is really determined to make sure we have a lot of it. Go forth and multiply, we get told over and over again, right? And then of course there's the simple fact that if we believe that everything that exists in creation is created by God, that God ultimately is in control, then one of the questions to ask is, why is it so enjoyable? Did God do that to torment us? To say the only way life continues is if you do this really incredibly enjoyable thing, but don't have any joy in it, or you're bad. I mean, that sounds like a really cruel and uncaring God, right? Who sets up the system to make it hard on us. To do even just the basic thing of life continuing. So it poses some sort of interesting and complex questions about our history, our theology, the development of our beliefs and traditions, and maybe keeping Song of Songs in our Bibles and being able to read it from time to time with all of the intense language and imagery is okay.
I'm trying to, I agree with the concept that sexuality and the joy and ecstasy in it is a gift.
Mm-hmm.
The question is it a gift that's to be shared only with your soulmate?
That's
And
a big question.
this basically is one man and one woman, I guess.
Right. The implication here, even though we got a few other voices who kind of come in and add commentary, this story is only between two people. Even if you take it in its most sexual interpretation, Song of Songs only involves the two lovers as far as the erotic components. But the question you raise is a very deep and complicated one, because we have our church traditions, which have generally pushed the idea of just two people, or for a long time, just a man and a woman. But there's also compelling arguments within Scripture that are inclusive of people who live a life of being single, as that still being a divine vocation, and also of especially in the Hebrew Bible, there are many examples of characters who are lifted up in a very positive light, who have more than one
Well,
partner.
and then you go back to the concept is, especially the Old Testament, is it written as man is trying to develop a structure of society that works? And in that society, does that society work better if you have a man and a woman with a family? Or does it work better if you have several partners in a village? I don't know the answer to that. I mean, we certainly as a society have gone towards a man and a woman and a family.
Well, in the Western Christian world, yes.
Yeah, pretty much all over the world. I mean, you have to go into the primitive, and who talking about primitive? No, I'm talking about
I know what you mean.
societies specifically found in Southeast Asia and or Africa.
Right.
That live more of a community life.
Mm-hmm. So, I'm going to disagree with you because there are very large swaths of culture of Islam today, and even in developed parts of Africa, where polytheism is still relatively normal. In fact, I was really surprised when I was a participant in a program at UW-Madison called the Lubar Institute, Institute for Study of Abrahamic Religion. So it's Jews, Christians, and Muslims working together. And I met a UW-Madison college student who was from a Middle Eastern country, and she spoke positively and favorably about the idea of men having multiple wives. And she described how, as a community, as a culture, as a family, how much advantage and benefit there was to that system for people who accepted that lifestyle, who were okay with it. And I always had thought, and this was my stereotype, that the idea of men having multiple wives was just a patriarchal, male-driven, this is what a man wants, of course men want more wives. The funny thing is, if you actually talk to people who live even in the cities and the well-developed areas and very cultured areas in modern-day Islam, it's often the men who don't want a second wife or a third wife because of the financial burden and the extra work and all of that. And it's often the first wives who are asking for a second wife to help out with responsibilities and to share and caring and taking care of the kids and all of that. Now that's not a universally true thing, but it's still very prevalent in society today, outside of Western Christian or communism. Also seems to be pushing towards the one man, one woman model as well. Of course, that gets complicated too. So there's still some pretty significant places outside of the mountains of Nepal where cultures are still polytheistic, or not polytheistic, polyamorous. I think I said polytheistic earlier too. We're going to wrap there, just at least for the video. We're going to talk about a couple more things here in person, but it's time to close up the video so it doesn't get too big or too long for you. And then we'll be closing with the Lord's Prayer. Thanks for joining us, and when we're back, we'll dive into the book of Job, and I hope you will join us then.